Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Lauren. It's always good to see you, hang out with you. Thankful to be here.
Yes, I'm excited to have you. I realized that you have not been on the podcast yet, but we have chatted for like what 2.5 years. We've been chatting and in the same like curriculum circles, and I've gotten to know more about Crossform Kids, which we'll talk about at some point throughout this episode. But I was like, I never had you on the podcast, so it's time. It's been a long time coming. I'm excited for you to help us better understand how to teach kids deeper and richer theology. And that's kind of like what we're focusing on over this spring season is just what are some of these big theological concepts that seem sometimes scary to us as adults. And then that translates into not communicating it to kids because it seems scary to us, which for sure it's like, well, it's going to seem scary to them, which is always not true. And so, kind of what I hoped out of this conversation is that people would have a better understanding and better tips and tools in their tool belt to help kids understand salvation and how
Yeah.
to communicate salvation, how to communicate the gospel story. And you were someone that comes to mind as someone who loves the kids ministry space, who speaks at camps all the time. And so I'm excited to have you on the podcast. But why don't you back us up a little bit and do a quick overview of you and all the things that you have going on?
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks, Lauren. Again, I'm really thankful to be here. It's good to hang out. So I'm Ryan Coatney. The reason that I'm here is because I run a ministry called Crossformed Kids, and Crossformed Kids exists to equip families, churches, and schools to raise up the next generation of lifelong Christ followers by promoting predictable and observable biblical literacy. So that's what Crossform Kids is all about. I'm also a church planting pastor at Grace Story Church in the Donaldson neighborhood of Nashville. And I'm also the head of school at Imago Classical Academy in Lebanon, Tennessee. But more importantly than that, I'm a husband. My wife, Emily, is awesome, and father of 6. The oldest is 9, 7, 5, 3, 1, and just like 14 days today. So, yeah.
2 weeks. That's it.
Yeah.
My
So
goodness.
that's kind of the ecosystem of what I'm up to, the things that I'm trying to, but all of that is really connected in that I'm just really, really committed to seeing the decline of the church reversed in our
Mhm.
lifetime. And I think the way that we're going to do that is through really skillful and faithful discipleship of kids. So,
Yeah, that's awesome. I totally agree. I think we would love to see more churches feel confident when it comes to sharing the gospel and have an increase in Bible literacy for both kids and volunteers.
yeah.
And so I want to just jump right into this conversation because it's easy for us to get stuck, right? It's easy for us to get stuck when we're trying to teach kids big theological questions. I often encourage volunteers of don't answer the question you think the kids are asking, just answer the question that they're asking because a lot of times what they're asking is way simpler than the way that our adult brains tend to assume that what they're asking is like so complex, but it actually is a very simple question. And so I'm curious, like, why don't you share a little bit about what are some of your favorite ways that you have taught kids the gospel or really just overarching theological concepts? Like, do you have this is what I practice and this is like my core philosophy when it comes to teaching kids these big theological terms?
Yeah. That's such a great question, Lauren. So I want to start by just kind of answering the last part of your question because that'll help me get to where the first part of your question lands, which is what's the overarching philosophy? And
Mhm.
when I'm teaching kids, I'm starting with a text. So, for example, last year at camp, I taught through Jonah. And what that means is that the book of Jonah actually like imposed limits upon what I might say and what I might not
Mhm.
say because it's a text, it's authoritative, it's inspired by God, and it has a message. So I want to unpack that message for the kids. And that's going to kind of constrain the way that I'm going to end up sharing the gospel or whatever else may happen, right? But what I find is that regardless of the text, a lot of the same illustrations still fit in terms of articulating things that might be complex for kids and
Mhm.
helping them to get in on the kind of the emotional, imaginative side of what salvation looks like,
Yeah.
because kids live in their feelings and their imagination. Like,
Mhm.
really, if we were to make a diagram of what percentage of a kid is like emotions and imagination, it's kind of like water, it's almost their entire being is
Yeah.
emotions and imagination. So, we really want to connect there. And the way that I think we do that is that we find the concept that we're trying to get across, and then we try to find a connection point between that concept and something that kids already feel or imagine,
Okay.
right? So that's kind of how I get there. So I start with this commitment. I'm going to unpack the text, and then I'm going to find what concepts are in the text and try to connect those with something that kids already feel or imagine. That
Yeah.
does that prompt some more questions?
It does, because I'm curious. So going back to your Jonah example, we'll use
Yep.
that because this is what you've taught on before. So take
Okay.
the text of Jonah,
Yep.
and what was that like imaginative piece that you connected for kids? Because I think I hear emotion and this is so not great, but I think manipulation.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's
No.
not what you're doing. Like, I know I know you enough to know that that's not the goal, is like manipulating their emotions to think the same way that you think, but it is understanding, oh, these kids are very tied to their emotions and their imagination. So why wouldn't we try to meet them where they're at? And so I have this balance in my own brain of like, well, I don't want, and I think maybe this is my own upbringing of like, I don't want to manipulate them into making a decision that they're not ready to make, or
Right.
to try and have them think a certain way. Like, I want them to be transformed by the gospel story and not just saying yes or believing something because Miss Lawrence said it. And so maybe unpack a little bit more of what you mean of like tying this concept to an imagination or an emotion where the kids are.
Yeah. Absolutely. So what I mean is, I'm not trying to evoke emotion. What I'm
Okay.
trying to do is help them understand this concept,
Yeah.
and their emotions are something that they already understand. Like, in the way that
Yes.
kids understand things, they already feel that, right? So
Uh-huh.
so I'll give you an example. It's not even my illustration, right? But this is a buddy of mine's illustration. But it was a long time ago, and he was trying to get across this idea of reconciliation, right? So reconciliation, what we mean by that is that the relationship between us and God is broken because of sin. Reconciliation is the means by which Jesus makes it right, right? That's what just for the audience. So his illustration was, and this was it was like a couple of decades ago, right? But he popped up a picture of George W. Bush, check this out, hugging Osama bin Laden, right? So, like, right there, that's not really gonna provoke emotion in an audience. But what it is gonna do is connect this concept with an emotional experience,
Huh.
right? That's one example. Here's another example. When I talk about the faithfulness of God, right? So in order to get that across, I tell a story about my own childhood. And
Mhm.
in my own childhood, dad was supposed to I'm from a divorced family, by the way. So my parents were divorced. I'm not living with my dad, but he was supposed to come and get me, take him to work with him, right? And in this moment, I woke up early, had to get up at like 4:45 to go to work with my dad, right?
Mhm.
And I wake up and I accidentally fall asleep on the couch, and while I'm waiting for my dad, and I wake up just in time to see him giving up on me coming to the door. And he's driving off, right? So there's this emotional experience that I had that
Yeah.
may be familiar to some of the kids, but then my dad actually comes back. He just like went to the gas station and came back and tried again, right? And so I'm trying to help kids see with an emotional sort of signpost what
Yeah.
it means for God to be faithful to us. It
Yeah.
means that he doesn't give up. He keeps trying, right? So
Yeah.
so that's what I mean. I'm not trying to create emotions in the kids. I'm
Right.
trying to help them remember emotions and then
Yeah.
connect it to a concept. Does that
Yeah.
help?
No, that's super helpful. And I love how you kind of distinguish between evoking emotion and just helping them connect the emotions that they're already feeling to a concept. I mean, that's kind of exactly what you see Jesus do with all the parables, right? He's like telling a story to connect to what whoever he is talking to and help them connect the dots between what he's asking them to do or what he's trying to teach them to something that they would be familiar with.
Yeah,
And I think that's such a good distinguishable like phrase of like we're not trying to evoke emotion, right? We're not trying to like dim the lights and get everybody in tears. Like it's just that's
right.
not what we want to do. I mean that like is more like middle school, high school age, but still it's like we don't want to manipulate the atmosphere so that there's emotions that don't need to be there to help them understand the gospel. And so I think that's a really helpful thing to think through, especially as like we're coming up on Easter Sunday, we're coming up on camp, we're coming up on vacation Bible school, and like we think a lot about the environments that our kids are going to be in. And I think it's okay to just connect to use a story to connect to what the kids are already feeling and not necessarily like work to evoke some emotion. I think that's helpful.
Yeah. That's it. And the last thing we want, look, when we do try to evoke emotion in kids, what we end up with is like a herd response. So
Mhm.
we end, that's why, like, this is crazy. I've actually preached at camps where every single kid in the audience made a profession of faith that night. And the reason that happened is, well, that's in spite of my efforts. And we'll talk about this in a
Right.
minute about the way I do invitations. But the reason
Yeah.
that it happened is because they had been prompted by other leaders to expect
Mm.
that they were gonna experience this thing, and literally every kid at the camp made a profession of faith. I was, like, devastated, like, what is going
Right.
on?
It's
Like, this is
yeah.
not the way it works, But that's when we evoke emotion, we get that kind of response, though, that can
Yeah.
happen, where everybody's just kinda rushing down front because everybody's rushing down front, and we don't want that. Yeah.
Right, right. And it is tricky. I just feel like there's this constant balance that kids ministry leaders have to live in, this tension of you want to present the gospel, but you don't want it to be this herd acceptance because people are doing it, or this peer pressure that kids are feeling to like respond or do something or pray a certain way. And I just feel like we just sit in this tension of how do we do this well and in a way that helps kids understand what sin is and the depths of what Jesus has done for them.
Yeah.
And without it being this everybody comes forward to the front every single Sunday. And I think I'm still navigating that tension of how do we present the gospel and how do we give kids the opportunity to respond, especially because most of the time it's happening in a place where parents are not present. And I am team parent all the way. I'm like, if parents, we want parents to be present for this moment, whether they're believers or not. And we want to help them champion this conversation. And so let's start with how do you often present the gospel in the multitude of scenarios where you are teaching kids? What does that typically look like?
Yep. So it kind of comes in like a three-step process, right? And I actually, Lauren, like I use the same 3 or 4 illustrations to get this across almost at every
Mhm.
camp. Like if you
Right.
hear me preach at a camp, I'm going to use these illustrations. The reason is because, I mean, by God's grace, I've preached over 100,000 kids at this point, and I've used hundreds, if not thousands, of illustrations in that time.
Mhm.
And I just know these are the ones that they they get the point across.
Yeah.
So, and if they'll help anybody else, they're welcome to use them. But first, I want to make sure that kids feel and understand that sin is universal,
Mhm.
right? The second thing I want kids to feel and understand is that their sin does matter, because kids typically aren't really committing sins that are going to be on anybody's top 10 list.
Right.
They're just not doing a lot of really bad stuff. They're kids. So, and they're aware of that. They understand what kind of world they live in. They understand what kind of life they live, and they just know. So we have to help them see that their sin is a big deal. And then
Mhm.
we want to attach their the big deal of their sin to the glory of God.
Yeah.
So that's my goal. And then once they're sold on that problem, once they understand that that's the basic problem, now it's very simple to explain the solution and help them
Mhm.
see how Jesus is the solution. I can just, you want me to share the illustrations that I use most
Yeah,
often? Yeah, you
sure.
guys can have it. It's free. I mean, you can just do it. For helping kids understand that sin is universal, I start by helping them imagine that I'm robbing a bank. I'm a bank robber,
Mhm.
right? I go and rob the bank. I go in and give me all your money. Then I take all the money. I go out and I get in my car and I take off driving. As soon as I get in my car, Lauren, I'm going the exact speed limit. I'm talking about right on the money. If it's 35
Mhm.
miles per hour, I'm at 35 miles per hour. If there's a stoplight, I'm stopping, with plenty of time. I'm being very careful. Every stop sign, every stoplight, every turn signal. I mean, I am obeying the law perfectly. And I see a police officer behind me. And I just kind of like, surely he's not trying to pull me over. I keep driving. And finally, I run out of gas. The police officer comes up to the car and is like, "Hey, you're under arrest." And I say, "Why am I under arrest?" And he's like, "Well, you just robbed a bank. You're under arrest for a bank robbery." Well, I plead my case. "Look, man, I know I robbed a bank. That took about, I mean, a minute, 15 seconds. I've been obeying the law perfectly for 3 hours now. I
Yeah.
mean, I've obeyed thousands of laws since I left. So really, you going to arrest me for a minute, 15 seconds when I've been obedient for 3 hours?"
Mhm.
And the police officer obviously is going to say, "Yeah, but you were obeying all those laws in a getaway car. So everything you did in the getaway car was illegal," right? So that's how I get across the kids. Look, like, I know that you're doing all these good things, but if you're doing those while you're running away from God instead of towards
Mhm.
him, everything that you're doing is part of your disobedience. It's part of your
Yeah.
rebellion. So that's the first thing, to help them see that sin is universal. They really are sinners.
Mhm.
Then I want to help them see that their sin's a big deal. And the way I do that is by helping them see that God's a big deal. So I
Mhm.
just tell this story, kind of bring them into it. That into the auditorium crawls a little ant, and the ant makes its way to the stage. And when it gets up to me, I stomp it. And I just ask them, "Is anybody upset with me?" And like two or three kids will be like, "Yeah, don't stomp the ant, but for the most part, nobody cares about the ant." Then I'm like, "Okay, next, a butterfly flies into the room. The butterfly flutters up here, it stops and lands on your fingers. And, it comes and I put up my finger, it lands on my finger and I pet it a little bit. And then I just rip off a tiny piece of its wing. Then I let it go. And I'm like, 'Kids, is anybody mad at me now?' Right? And now the kids are starting to get a little bit upset. I mean, they're like, 'Yeah, what are you doing?' They're getting mad, right? Now I say, 'Okay, now into the room comes a little puppy.' And it's not just
No.
any puppy, it's one of those oodles that everybody loves, sweet little
Noodles.
puppy. It's, some kind of oodle. It's coming up and it's getting on the stage. And right as it walks up to me, instead of petting it, I drop kick it into the back of the auditorium.
Oh.
At this point, Lauren, the kids are ready to rush the stage. I'm not joking. I mean, they're like beside themselves. Okay.
Yes.
So now I'm going to have their complete attention, and I'm able to point out to them that I actually became less and less violent, and they became more and more angry. The ant's dead, right? The butterfly is disfigured. It's missing half of a wing. The
Mhm.
puppy's fine. He just got his feelings
Right.
hurt, you know? So why are you guys getting more and more angry? There's no excuse for that except for one. What is it? Well, you know that puppy is intrinsically more valuable than that ant.
Mhm.
It doesn't matter how great the crime against it is. If it's the puppy, it's just automatically a greater crime than whatever I did to the ant. And
Mhm.
then I help them move that over to God himself.
Mhm.
So what does that mean about the magnitude of any of our sin against the God who made us? Right? It's enormous just by virtue of having been a sin against God. So now kids know, yes, I am a sinner, and yes, my sin is a very big deal, right? That's solved. And so I can now present the gospel solution to
Mhm.
children who understand that they actually need it. Like they desperately need what Jesus came to offer. So that's the way I approach it. Pretty much, I mean, I would say 90% of camps, I'm going to use those illustrations, you know. The second one, actually, I think that came from my friend Andy. Yeah, so I stole it from him. You can steal it from me, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
100%.
awesome. Those
Yeah.
are great ways. I like that. Do you have a like, I know sometimes what's really helpful is like a demonstration to talk through the gospel story, and it's whether it's like the 3 circles or ABC or whatever tool is out there. Do you typically just like, do you use one of those resources? Do you just share the gospel as is? Do you read from the text? Like, what does that typically look like for you as when you're like, obviously the salvation is a very big term that covers a lot of what we see throughout the Bible. And so it's like when you were talking about salvation, it's like salvation is like the decision, right? We say like we made a salvation decision, but then what comes before that is like presenting the gospel. And so do you have a this is how I say it, or here are some key points that I like to hit when we're talking about the gospel? What does that typically look like?
Yeah. So it's more of an approach than a formula. I do if you're
Mhm.
just looking for if anybody's looking for something like that, like a tool, there's one called Who Will Be King and Two Ways to Live. I think one of those is the kid version, one is the grown-up version, and the
Yeah.
kid version of that is really excellent. So I would
Okay.
recommend that. Check it out. And the circles one is good too. Jimmy Scroggins did a great job with that. I think it's really helpful in terms of what I've used.
Mhm.
Who Will Be King is really, really good. But I don't usually do it that way. Instead, I use an approach that I call apprenticeship. So in the conversation, I want to apprentice myself to the child. And the
Mhm.
reason is because the child is a subject matter expert in the matters of their own heart. So
Mhm.
what I want to do in this conversation is I want to ask skillful questions that lead them to discover the things I was just talking about in the
Yeah.
illustrations, that lead them to see or to just let me know that they already see that they're
Mhm.
sinners, that lead them to see that their sin is a big deal, and that lead them to see that Jesus is the only solution. But I'm doing that through questions. I want to have a conversation to help get them there. And I think we're going to get to this in a minute, Lauren. I hope it's
Mhm.
okay to go ahead and segue
Yeah,
there. But
go for it.
in general, there's a principle, like a Christian worldview principle, the principle of subsidiarity. And that principle just articulates that we want ministry to happen in the closest, smallest context possible,
Mhm.
the most organic context possible. So when I'm at camp and I'm preaching from the stage, most of the time at camp, it's in my job description to give a certain number of
Right.
invitations. And so of course, I'm going to honor that. It's their camp. I'm there to preach. So, but in honoring that from the stage, I'm going to push that conversation to a more organic context, which means I'm going to ask the kids to speak with a leader from their church.
Yeah.
You see what's happening?
Yep.
I'm just placing it from this abstraction, which is a stage speaker, to a real conversation with someone who has a relationship with them.
Mhm.
So that's from the stage, right? Now, in the context of the local church, that's a very organic context, but I'm still going to push it to an even more organic context. And
Mhm.
I'm going to push that conversation to the home
Right.
whenever I can. And
Yeah.
so that's the way I operate. That's just my worldview thinking kind of taking practical shape. So I
Mhm.
want parents to have those conversations as often as that's possible. Now, there are going to be situations where a parent doesn't feel capable, doesn't feel equipped, but that again, that's my fault as a pastor. My people should feel capable. They should
Right.
feel equipped, right? So
Yeah.
I'm going to go back and fix that rather than immediately jumping in with, okay, I'll just do it, you know? So,
Right.
yeah, that's kind of the way I think about it, Lauren. I hope that's
Yeah.
a little bit helpful.
No, I love that because I think the more and more research that comes out, it's like we are reminded that relationships in ministry are like the number one tool when it comes to discipleship and faith formation and consistency in the church. And so we want to highlight those relationships. We want those to be the primary vehicle that we have some of these salvation conversations. Because I think going back to kind of what we talked about at the beginning of like sometimes from stage, there can be this peer pressure of like, raise your hand. And it's like, well, is everyone just going to raise their hand? And I think pushing that towards, hey, talk with a leader from your church, talk to a parent, talk to a volunteer. And I think there is like, I hope kids ministry leaders feel the weight of their responsibility to disciple their volunteers
Yeah,
and to
that's
work
right.
alongside the adult discipleship pastor or whoever's over adult discipleship to really disciple the parents, because I think that's the missing link of child discipleship is like you can be doing all the things as the kids director or as the youth pastor. You can be doing all the right things and saying all the right things and presenting all the right stories and analogies and all the things, but if that missing link from parents and volunteers to help connect the dots from what was said on stage to what happens next is a big missing link that I think sometimes we often forget because we're so focused on what's the core message, what are we going to teach?
Yeah,
But then if there's no one to help kids take the next step, whatever that step may be, or answer
yeah,
some of those big questions, well, then it's like, well, how are you moving them forward in their faith? And so I hope that people feel the weight of like, okay, yes, I need to make sure what's said from stage is important. And that's why we put a lot of trust in the curriculums that we buy and different things like that. But then it's like, oh, I need to put some energy into making sure that our volunteers and parents can take that next step with kids. And there will be scenarios where kids don't have a good relationship with mom or dad, or they're not in a home where their parents are believers. And
right.
so that's where the church wants to fill the gap. And that's where the volunteers can come in. And so, but I think relationships are so important in this conversation because it's not just getting a salvation decision, right? We want to make disciples, and making disciples requires relationships from
Yeah,
one area or another. And so I think that's
absolutely.
a really good perspective. How often in a church context, because then there's like the camp context is like maybe like for VBS for us growing up, it was always like the Thursday or Wednesday of VBS of kids camp. There's always this like big decision day, and it's like we do this big thing. And in terms of the Sunday morning, how often do you typically present the gospel? Like, how often are you clearly, because obviously their gospel story is weaved into every story we see throughout scripture and the overarching story of the Bible. But it's like, how often are you distinctly saying, like, you are a sinner, your sin is a big deal, Jesus is the answer, and what he did through his death, burial, and resurrection is like opening the gates so that your sin can be removed and you can have an everlasting relationship with him. How often are you distinctly saying that and maybe giving kids an opportunity to respond, or at least pushing them towards that smaller environment in those relationships?
Yeah. So that's going to depend a lot upon the kind of context that I'm in. I'll
Mhm.
say that, and I've been in every size of church and children's ministry, Lana. Anywhere from I've served in church over 30,000. I've been a pastor of a church with like 15 people. So I've seen it all, and
Mhm.
I would say that the larger the context, the more frequently I'm going to explicitly
Mm.
communicate the gospel in the way that you just described. And the reason is because basically what you want to do is you want to think about two different variables. The first one is how much exposure are you going to have, like in an ongoing way, to these kids?
Right.
How consistently will you be seeing them? And then how how ready are they to hear the
Mhm.
gospel, right? You want to
Mm.
kind of weigh those two things together. And in the context of a really big church, the truth is a lot of kids you're not going to see that consistently. And many of them are going to be in one time and you're never going to see them again. That's
Right.
just because you have a huge front door in a large church like that. That's just the way it
Yeah.
works. In that context, I'm going to make a clear gospel presentation most Sundays, if not every Sunday,
Mhm.
right? In my own church, like where there's, 40, 50 kids, something like that, right? I'm I'm going to I'm going to lean much more in a strategic direction where I'm trying to provide them with a robust biblical literacy, and
Yeah.
I'm making that gospel presentation only at key moments that seem strategic, right?
Yeah.
So those are kind of the two ends, and I think you're going to find your sweet spot based on the just the realities of your context somewhere in between there. I doubt if
Mhm.
anybody is past either one of those ends, you know.
Right.
So those are just kind of the two extremes, I think. I'm not a super conversionistic guy, Lauren. Here's what I try to tell people. If you're raising kids in a Christian home, and if the majority of the families in your church are raising kids in a Christian home, which means the majority of your kids are being raised in a Christian home,
Mhm.
then we want to proceed with the assumption that these kids know Jesus. So
Right.
we're raising them as Christians, not
Mhm.
to be Christians,
Yeah.
which means we don't feel a pressure to continually press for conversion. If that's not your context, right,
Yeah.
then you need to proceed differently, right?
Yeah.
But for most of us who are in a church context where we have discipled our adults and they're real Christians who are
Mhm.
training their kids, I think we can proceed with that assumption. And then
Yeah.
we can really focus on strategically preparing our kids for a life of faith.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. And that brings up so much of like this conversation on teaching kids theology comes from experience in my own home. So I was like, this is really for me. My kids are 7, and by the time this episode comes out, my son will be 4.
Okay.
And they would tell you that they love Jesus and that they know Jesus.
Yeah.
Like they would, it's just a constant conversation in our home. We're always talking about the Bible. We're always talking about God. We're always talking about how the ways that he's with us and doing all the things. It's just, we have a very high emphasis on discipleship in our home, and we do the best that we can in all the different scenarios.
Yeah.
But my kids have never had, I mean, I think a lot of times people refer to it as like a Paul like transformation, right? Where it's like this moment where it's like, yes, I'm going to do a 180 of my life and make the decision to follow Jesus. My kids have
Yeah.
never, like, we have not sat down together and like prayed a prayer. And so it's something that like my husband and I are constantly thinking through of like, what does this look like for our kids who were raised up in a, or who are being raised in a Christian home with Christian grandparents who like, it's just, they were raised up in the church. They are definitely there as like they're at church often every weekend. We're just heavily involved in our local church, and they haven't really had this like come to Jesus moment. It's more of this, well, of course we talk about Jesus all the time. Of course I know who he is. Of course I love him. Of course I know that he loves me. And so sometimes, a lot of times, kids ministry leaders can ask the question, well, are they actually saved? Have they done this check 1, 2, 3? And I'm curious, you obviously have your own set of kids and you're working to disciple kids in your own church that are being raised up in a Christian home. What do you say? What do you do? What's your encouragement to kids ministry leaders who may be asking the question, how do we verify salvation?
Yeah. Yeah. That we can't help but ask those questions and wonder about those things, right? So here's I'm just going to say a few things and I'll just number
Okay,
them because why not, right? The
great.
first thing I'll say is that I expect my kids' conversion to be invisible to me.
Mm,
And the reason is because the way the conversion happens, the way the Bible describes it, is that the Word of God instigates new life in the heart of a human being. And that happens upon the hearing of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So
hmm
my kids hear the gospel all the time, just like you just described, Lauren. They're constantly hearing the gospel. They're constantly like singing it, reading it, talking about it. You know, it's constant. So there's no way for me to know at which one of those tiny little moments the
mm,
Lord does the miracle of creating new life in their heart. I'm
hmm
not going to know that. That's the
Yeah.
first thing. So I assume it's going to be invisible to me. Number two, I assume that my kids being raised in a Christian home are their their new character is going to be less obvious to me than what would be the case with like an adult who comes from like a
Right.
sorted background and is saved and the
Yeah.
kind of fruit I would look for. I mean, there's just not going to be this enormous difference. Now, I do think we'll see fruit. We will see evidence. We will see that, but we have to be very attentive, right?
Mhm.
So, and that leads me to number 3, which is like the way that I want to proceed with my kids and is just to have these kind of gospel gut checks with them, right? Just like, hey, you know, when they ask me a question about heaven, then the way I answer them is, if you trust Jesus, then you can hope for this, right? And I'll communicate. I'm confident that you do trust Jesus, but I always put that if there because I don't want to make guarantees to them that they can now
Right.
misunderstand. So I do presume that they're in the faith and I raise them as Christians, not to be Christians. But I do also make sure that they always understand the connection between faith and this hope that I share with them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's the way I operate inside of my home.
Mhm.
I don't know if I got off track on the full question, but I hope I answered like most of it.
No, that's good. I love the phrase. Well, I loved a lot of what you said. The first one is that like I that conversion will often be invisible to us. And that's for kids who have never gone a day without hearing the name of Jesus. That is a reality of just like it may not be this complete
Yeah.
180 life-changing moment. It may be a more gradual come to faith situation that is often like I think your character point is like so helpful because it is like, well, if we are raising them in a Christian home, we're raising them with a biblical worldview. They're not necessarily going to turn to something else because that's how they were raised.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's such an important reminder. And then just the last point you made of just about now I'm like blanking on the last point that you made, but so
That's
you might
okay.
have to remind me
Me too.
because it is I was like so focused on point 1 and 2 because as a parent, I'm like, oh, that's so helpful. Oh, but the last point you made of just assuming that they're not like you want to like walk carefully, right? Asking that question back of saying, well, like if you believe in Jesus, this is our hope. And so it's that gospel gut check that you told us of just like, hey, this is your reality if you believe in Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that that's helpful. The phrase that you said, which is we're not looking to raise our kids to be Christians, we're raising them as Christians. And I think even in the Sunday morning kids ministry context, it's helpful to say like, hey, we're not raising them so that one day, we're not teaching them so that one day they can be Christians. It's like they can live as Christians right now. And it's not like, oh, well, when they get to student ministry or when they get to be an adult, they get to all of a sudden be a Christian. And so we're raising them to be a Christian. So like we're going to treat them and raise them as Christians today. And I think that's so helpful, even as kids ministry leaders are engaging with parents. I think it's always comes up around baptisms, which most people have baptisms around Easter. And so it is always this like ongoing conversation of like, what is the fruit of their life and how are you assessing salvation? And it can be legalistic is a very strong word,
Yeah.
but it can turn that way of have they prayed this prayer, have they done this, and it can just be sometimes very gray in the kids ministry world.
Yeah. What I found, Lauren, is that when people push back on this with me, the reason that they're usually pushing back is that they're worried about assurance. So
Mhm.
if a kid doesn't have like this thing that they remember, this moment of conversion, then how are they going to have
Yeah.
assurance? But I
Yeah.
think actually the reason that some people who don't have that moment lack assurance is because the pastors in their life have put such an emphasis on that moment,
Yeah.
right? So like
Yeah.
I remember in high school, like evangelists coming and saying, if you don't remember the moment that you were saved, you need to get right with God right now. That's, and that I remember sitting there thinking like, I don't remember ever not believing the
Right.
gospel.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my bad. But
Yeah.
I something in me knew like, okay, I don't need to respond to this. He means well, but he's off on this.
Yeah.
But what I've realized as an adult was like that's how people's assurance gets undermined. Is from that sort of ministry, right? Whereas if we associate assurance with our faith, right? Like
Mhm.
our ongoing faith in Jesus,
Mhm.
it's a state of faith in Jesus, not a moment of decision, right? then that assurance can be, and we also know that baptism brings assurance. And so that
Mhm.
gospel gut check can help us shepherd our kids toward baptism as well. Which none of my kids have been baptized yet, and I'm totally cool with
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
I help them know, hey, this is what obedience to Jesus looks like. And
Mhm.
when you're ready, we need to take this step.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, Ryan, this was really helpful, and I'm just going to be thinking about it for the rest of the day. But why don't you why don't you give us a brief overview on where people can find you, a little bit of, because you also have this entire curriculum, which I'll link in the show notes, where you can hear me talk about Crossform Kids in one of our curriculum YouTube videos. And why don't you just give us a brief overview on what Crossform Kids is?
Yeah. So Crossform Kids is a curriculum for families, churches, and schools that produces predictable, in other words, you can know that it's going to happen, and observable, in other words, you can see it happening, biblical literacy. So that happens through a 108 unit scope and sequence that walks through the covenant structure of the Bible. So what we're trying to do is help kids read fruitfully from every page of scripture for a lifetime. And we do that by helping them understand the stories that the authors return to over and over again when they're writing the Bible, right?
Mhm.
So that's how Crossform Kids works. It's built on a catechism that teaches biblical theology from Genesis all the way to the end of the Bible, helping kids know how the whole thing fits together. And it makes it stick through the most dynamic songs that you're going to find in children's ministry space. So, yeah, look it up. I'd love to have you get started with Crossform Kids or any other curriculum that produces predictable and observable biblical literacy. But that should be the
Yes.
goal of every children's ministry leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And I'm a big fan of Crossform Kids. I've talked about it a lot. I think it's really helpful. There's not just anytime you're looking at a curriculum, my encouragement is make sure there's something for both kids and parents, right? We want
Yeah.
to be equipping both kids and parents, and we want to help connect the dots between what's happening on Sunday and what's happening at home. And I think Crossform Kids does that in such a beautiful way. And so we'll link all the things in the show notes. People can find
Yeah.
you, people can learn more about the school that you're launching and how cool that is.
Yeah.
And if they're in your area, they can just get plugged in with all the fun things that are happening. Okay. Ryan,
Absolutely.
thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Lauren. I really enjoyed hanging out, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.